Nobody explained to Joe Strummer that smoking weed in Jamaica was actually illegal. There was a lot of political violence in Jamaica at that time. A bunch of gunmen were going to come down the studio. Joe Strummer was playing the old out-tuned piano in the studio. He got a tap on the shoulder and they said, look, you've got to get out of here. Otherwise, it could get really nasty.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. If you'd like to support the podcast and get episodes commercial-free, sign up for the Backstage Pass from Patreon. It's just $5 a month. Episodes absolutely commercial-free on the audio versions. The link in the show notes or go to bookedonrock.com. Now, our guest, Pat Gilbert, is a former editor of Mojo, the best-selling and internationally acclaimed music magazine, whose monthly special editions he still oversees. He also has contributed to the Late Q magazine, The Guardian, The Times, and The Sunday Times, and has produced radio programs for the BBC. He's just released the new expanded 50th anniversary edition of Passion is a Fashion, the real story of The Clash. Thanks so much for being here, Pat.
You're welcome, Eric. Yes, thank you for inviting me on. And I love your Jaws t-shirt, by the way.
Yes, I figured I'd wear it. We're in summertime, right?
Yeah.
Good time to wear it. Thank you so much.
Great film.
The original version of this book came out in 2004, if I have it correct, and it was revised in 2009.
Yeah, it had a light kind of spring clean in 2009, but because it was really to fix anything that was seriously wrong with the first edition. So this one has had a lot more work done on it, actually, and probably about another 10,000 words of extra material, I reckon. Yeah,
that's what I was going to ask. The 10,000 new words. What are the biggest additions or revelations that fans will discover in this new version, the expanded version?
Well, I got to talk to, the first time round, I kind of got to talk to everybody involved with the band, and most of the people who'd ever been in the Clash in all its different iterations. And but a few people kind of eluded me, and one of them was the baker, and the baker was Topper Headon, the drummer's drum tech, but he was their kind of roadie. And the Clash were very, very tightly knit unit, and maybe 7 or 8 people to the core of it, including the band. Johnny Green was their road manager, and Cosmo Vinyl, he was also somebody who was around the band as an aide to them. And Baker was the one that I didn't get to. So I've got plenty of Baker who just he just tells quite amusing stories. So there's stuff about when they went to Jamaica, for example, and nobody explained to Joe Strummer that smoking weed in Jamaica was actually illegal. So he gave a few more extraordinary insights into, they recorded in Jamaica in 1980 with Mikey Dread, the Jamaican producer. And everyone said, don't go to Jamaica, it's too dangerous. But kind of being the Clash, they thought that, they didn't heed that advice. And they were in Channel 1 studio, it's called a famous reggae studio. And there was a lot of political violence in Jamaica at that time, and a bunch of gunmen were going to come down the studio and see what's going on. So they had a tap. Joe Strummer was playing the old out-tuned piano in the studio. He got a tap on the shoulder, and they said, "Look, you got to get out of here. Otherwise, it could get really nasty." So they did. They managed to escape the studio, and they went to Montego Bay on the other side of the island, which is where the resorts are and the beaches are. And so Joe had a big bag of weed with him that he put on the table, as he was immediately arrested. So, and I think they had to bribe the police officer to let them off the hook. So there's lots of sort of Baker stories like that, little extra kind of a little seasoning on the story.
And you interviewed all 4 members: Joe Strummer, Mick Jones, Paul Simonon, and Topper Headon. Did each member remember the Clash in different ways?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I think yeah, they did. They all took it all very seriously. The story's quite. Although there's a lot of fun and adventures and kind of getting up to all kinds of mischief. As a group, I think they all held it dear, and they all held the message that it came out. I mean, they were like a protest band and a political band, and they all kind of realised that what they did was very, very, very special. And I guess Topper was quite regretful in the fact that he developed a drug habit, which meant that he was chucked out of the band. Um, Mick, I suppose there's an element of towards the end bitterness because he got thrown out, and he was the guy who essentially started the group. Paul, very, very pragmatic kind of guy, very keen to set straight some, bits in the story. But yeah, they all kind of they have very good memory about what's happened, and they can yeah, they all had good stories and could see the funny side of stuff too.
The road manager, Johnny Green, crucial in helping this book happen. What role did he play in earning the trust of the Clash inner circle?
That's a good another really good question. He in when the Clash came through in the UK in 1977, it was a very, very violent time in terms of the subcultures. People in Britain, you're either Teddy Boy and you listen to the old rock and roll stuff. There were skinheads who were into the reggae stuff. By the late 1970s, they were they'd become quite right wing, or factions of them had become very, very right wing, and you had like Nazi skinheads and so on and so forth. The mod movement coming through. So Clash gigs could kind of sometimes be a meeting for gangs or a lot of violence. And Johnny was a guy who kind of would put his life on the line to make sure they didn't come to any harm, and would if the band were involved in violence, he would kind of leap in, and he was a big guy and help them out. And they grew to love him because I think he adored, to the end of his life, he sadly died last year. He absolutely adored the Clash, and he adored his role of being their road manager and getting them out of mischief and bother.
You described the Clash as having detonated onto the London scene in 1976. What was so explosive and different about them compared to everyone else at the time?
I think the Clash were in a tradition of kind of rebel prophets, I would sort of say. So they were kind of a bit like Lennon in the early 70s, John Lennon, and Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, Bob Marley, of course. So I think they saw themselves in a slightly different role to the Sex Pistols, who were a bit more kind of anarchic, a bit more, badly behaved, and it's sort of the Clash had more of a vision and a purpose, and it struck a chord. And it's quite strange when a band has that dimension to them, that extra political edge. And you saw it later with people like Public Enemy, I guess, and Rage Against the Machine. Again, in that kind of tradition, it gave them a real kind of edge, and people just really latched onto it. They latched onto the edginess of it. The Clash in 1977 began making their own clothes, which were very kind of styled along military kind of lines with epaulettes and zips and D-rings and so on. So they did look like a kind of a guerrilla outfit, but the war that they were waging was one of kind of truth against power. And it just sort of became really alluring and really, really exciting, and I think it defined a lot of people's lives over here, definitely. I mean, and then when they went to America, yeah, again,
you've triggered my memory because my older brother Marty was a huge fan, and when I was a kid, I remember he used to wear the camouflage
Did he?
pants because
Right.
he loved
Yeah.
the Clash. His friend
Yeah.
wore camouflage. Yeah, that was the big thing. But it felt
Yeah.
authentic. That's the thing too. I mean, compared to many politically minded bands, the Clash, their message felt authentic. It didn't feel performative.
It didn't, and there were several reasons for that. One of them were that Mick and Paul were they were kids from London, and the back streets of London, and they grew up in areas where there was a lot of the West Indian immigrants had settled in London in the 1950s and the 1960s, and so they were out on the street at an early age. They came from essentially inner city areas, and that gave them that. So they were the real deal. I mean, they weren't hard men, they weren't tough men, but they had a streetwise attitude. They had a really good streetwise attitude. And then you had Joe Strummer, who he'd been brought up all around the world. His father was in the diplomatic service. So he used to get a tremendous amount of stick from the press in the UK in that he was a fraud because he wasn't from the back streets of London. That he'd been privately educated, and I don't think he even lived in England till he was 9 years old. So Joe got into a bit of a stick, but he was also had that, I don't know, he had that kind of leadership quality and that kind of charisma. He was able to kind of drive the whole thing forward as a front man. So they did get some stick about not being authentic, especially from some of the tougher, more working class punk bands. But the way they assimilated reggae and the whole Jamaican thing was very true.
London Calling you describe as a quantum leap musically. Why was that album such a turning point?
Because they'd gone to America. I think that was the big thing. Punk had burnt itself out in the UK, and people were like, where does music go? A lot of punk bands just split up because they were thinking, well, we've said everything we want to do. Music's getting more sophisticated. And the Clash had that same kind of crisis of confidence, but they'd been to America, and it kind of reignited their pre-punk love for R&B and soul music, basic rock and roll as well. And they could see, disco was starting to happen. There's a tiny little bit of disco influence in London Calling, and they put it all into this big cooking pot, and they kind of mixed it all up in that summer of 1979 and recorded London Calling. So there aren't many loud guitars on that album at all. It's more music. I mean, musically, it's very interesting because there are so many influences, and particularly the reggae thing and the ska thing was coming in too. So a lot of people actually over here got put off by that. They lost quite a lot of fans, but they also gained a big international audience because it started to feel more like a band with the kind of musical depth of Springsteen or someone like that.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. Chapter 11 starts, and Chapter 11 is titled Hell Sucks. It starts with, quote, "It still irks many British Clash fans that perhaps the group's finest hour after escaping punk rock happened over there." Their residency at Bond's International Casino over the first 2 weeks of June 1981 is still remembered as one of the most exciting and influential events in New York during the early 1980s. It was also the key to transforming the Clash from a cool alternative group in the States into a million-selling top 10 act. Why did that residency there at Bond's International Casino become so legendary?
When the Clash went to America, they recorded their second album, or finished their second album with Sandy Perman in America, and then they went there in the beginning of 1979 and at the end of 79. And what they found was a kind of hero worship in a way that they didn't really know what to expect from American audiences, and I think they arrived in America without all the baggage that they had from being a punk band in London, and they were kind of viewed more in a more kind of pure and unallied kind of way, and so they were ready to get beer. They were everything was starting to brew in America, and when they got to Bonds in the early summer of 1981. They were going to do a large, maybe 60-date tour of the States, and the promoters found the fact that Sandinista, their fourth album, was named after the Nicaraguan, rebel army, which was fighting against the CIA-funded government at that time. It was all part of that whole business going on in Central America. And they were worried, actually, that booking agents wouldn't touch them. So they decided instead, or there'd be a lot of problems around them playing it off the beaten track in America. And so they decided to do a residency instead, just concentrate on New York, just do a whole week's worth of gigs in New York and just see what happened. And I think that was the point where they just realized that they'd touched a nerve in America, and it became a quite big thing. They were musically more sophisticated then. They looked absolutely amazing. They still had Topper Headon in the band, amazing drummer, and each of the Bonds shows became a kind of cultural event, because as their support acts, they were having people like Grandmaster Flash. So they were having the kind of hip hop guys, which bringing the hip hop stuff and the rock audiences together, and they had lots of other different bands. And the Beastie Boys, before they were the Beastie Boys, sort of came along and saw those shows, and it kind of moved them towards making more rap and hip hop influence records. So I mean, I wasn't there, unfortunately. I wish I had been, but they ended up doing 17 dates in the end, because the authorities decided that the venue wasn't big enough to hold as many people as tickets were being sold, so they had to do double the number of gigs.
17.
Yeah, 17 in a row.
Opening for The Who in 1982. That was another huge moment for the Clash. The band, they once positioned themselves against the old guard of rock. This presented huge ideological difficulties for the Clash. Were there internal disagreements within the band about taking that tour?
I think so. I would have guessed that Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon, Paul the bass player, were kind of less keen than Mick Jones, the guitarist, because I think Mick always wanted the band to be as big as possible. I think with other members in the Clash camp, they thought, well, is this making us the kind of band that we set out to destroy in the punk days 5 years earlier? Stadium gig, the tickets are generally overpriced, and the food is awful and expensive, and they're trying to sell you beer at inflated prices. So they did, but I think Cosmo Vinyl, who he was there their age in the second half of their career. He said something in the book that they realised what went down in England, and the rules that applied in England didn't now apply when they were going to the States. The States is so much bigger, so much more compartmentalized. You can't. It's not like England. You can't just do one tour and suddenly you become famous. It's just too big and too diverse. So they thought, well, if we're going to play to like 50 or 60,000 Who fans every night, that we're all we're doing is making our job easier. And Pete Townsend said that as a support band, they were great. He said they were really good. And there were always parallels between the Who and the Clash anyway. In a way, the Who, when they started off, they're quite punky in their own fashion, and the Clash loved the Who. So and they were, they're both or both bands were from London. So it worked, but it was kind of the last or second to last big thing they ever did.
Joe Strummer, he's born John Mellor.
John Mellor, yeah.
You explore that complicated relationship between Joe Strummer of the Clash, quote unquote, and John Mellor. Did researching his upbringing change how you viewed him?
No, because it was always in the music press at the time that Joe. I mean, as I mentioned before, that he came from a different background to the other people in the band. And rock and roll is about reinvention. Rock and roll is about you're a normal guy or gal, and you put on a set of clothes, you develop an attitude, you maybe take on a different name, and you transform yourself, and in doing so, you might end up transforming other people, how they behave, how they think, and so on. So I always knew Joe would be a sort of complicated person to meet, but when you did actually meet him, he was absolutely fine. He was full of mischief. He was full of fun. He had that, I never really felt he was putting on too much of an act. Especially towards the end of his life, in a Clash, he was became this kind of demon. It was a performance when he was on stage, definitely. But I think he kind of resolved those issues, or maybe it's just that whole thing about he was always driven to escape his upbringing. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think if you're born into a world that you're not comfortable with, sort of transcending that, I don't think by whatever means possible, I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Do you think Joe died still wrestling with the legacy of the Clash?
I think he did. And I think there's Chris Salovich, another British journalist who was, hung out with the Clash and wrote about them a lot at the time. He was always saying that Joe always wanted to reform the Clash. I think the Clash were Joe's big legacy, and he was always keen on the idea of getting them back on the road and getting them out there, because he maybe within that context was a context that he made most sense as a human being and to himself. He was Joe Strummer of the Clash. And you have to wind back. So if you wind back to like the late 90s and the very early 2000s, and Joe died in 2002, the Clash's stock was quite low at that point. In Britain in the 1990s, we had the big Cool Britannia thing with Oasis and Blur, and music moved on a generation, and nobody was talking about the Clash much at all. And when Joe formed his band, the Mescaleros, and after like almost a 10-year break, went back on the road with the Mescaleros, he was playing to relatively small audiences. I saw the first gig of his, or one of the very first gigs he did when he came back in '99, and it was to maybe 300 or 400 people. If it would have been the Clash, it would have been 4,000 people. And I think he found that quite difficult. And I think the music he made then was some of the best music that he ever made. It really was good, but it was never going to go anywhere commercially, or even possibly even pay for itself. So I think there was definitely a Clash reunion brewing at the time in Joe's head around the time he died.
Yeah, you think that would have happened pretty soon?
Well, they were in the last months of his life. It was announced the Clash were going to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So there was a lot of talk about whether they should get together to play around the induction. But as far as I mean, the Clash was a very complicated entity. But I think it was Paul Simonon who was the most trenchant in not wanting to play, because he viewed it as a kind of corporate event, or driven by corporate energy and forces. So he was against it. But whether they would have done, I don't know. I reckon it is 50-50.
Pat Gilbert is the author of the new expanded 50th anniversary edition of Passion is a Fashion, the real story of the Clash. Mick Jones, from a musical standpoint, let's talk about that. Was he the musical architect of the Clash? Because he incorporated a lot of that. You talk about, he was going out to the dance clubs, I think, listening to some of the new stuff that was out at the time. And that really plays a huge role in the music of the Clash, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And even on the first album in 1977, the really punky one, it's musically quite sophisticated. Mick had a kind of musical brain. I mean, he wasn't musically trained in any way. I mean, he in so much as just trained by listening to lots of great records when he was growing up. But he had the musical brain, and that first album is quite sort of, there's a lot going on. There's key changes. You might notice, you may or may not notice, there's little key changes in there. There's lots of little bridges, and the bass runs are quite kind of clever, and the way the two guitars kind of bounce off each other rhythmically. He was a very, very clever guy in that group. So and I think by London Calling, the third album, he was essentially the de facto producer, and he'd be the one suggesting all the overdubs. He'd be suggesting some of the studio techniques they could do to make the record, give it a bit more depth. And then, as you say, he was always looking for the new. So he was very much into the post-punk thing when it happened in the UK, and then he was gone into the hip-hop thing, which he carried on after the Clash finished with Big Audio Dynamite.
And had success with that, great success with that.
Yeah, so with Big Audio Dynamite, after the Clash, he carried on that vision of wanting to mix guitar, rock guitar with a dance beat, and made great records.
Was his firing the moment that the Clash effectively ceased being the Clash?
Okay, so there's two moments you can choose from. Okay, moment one was when Topper Headon was slung out in May 1982 because of his drug problems. The Clash were very, very brutal and tough unit, and they'd given him a chance to sort himself out, and he didn't, so he was out. And Topper was not only was he a superb drummer, he was also musically quite gifted, and he'd written the music to essentially all the music to Rock the Casbah. So his musical input was very, very, very important. So once he'd gone, but they stopped being, they were always Joe, Paul, Mick and Topper. It was always, that was the band. So when it wasn't Topper anymore, it's like, okay, is this a Clash? And then a year later, when they fired Mick for apparently being too much of a rock star, it wasn't the same after that. There was, of course, a second incarnation of the group, but for me, the Clash, the real Clash definitely ended with Mick.
Thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. You briefly mentioned ghostwriting sessions for Topper's unpublished memoir without revealing anything private, of course. But those conversations, what did they teach you about him as a person?
Oh, they were extraordinary. So this happened about 2013, maybe. And I'd go down to his house. I went for a few times down in Dover and on the coast. And he would talk for a long time, maybe 2 hours, non-stop. And for somebody who had a drug problem for a long time, he's got absolute total recall. So extraordinary, detailed kind of behind the scenes insight into some of the things that happened, and very, very kind of some of these guys, in recovery, as they say. He was very open about all the drug stuff, and he didn't ever say anything bad about any of the other guys in the group at all. It was all more about details about his own life and his own journey. And he's quite vulnerable. He was quite a vulnerable character. He'd talk about how I didn't realise the extent that he felt out of his depth, thrown into the world of the Clash, because it was such a kind of brutal and aggressive and perhaps not very welcoming place to be. Like in 1970, I think as they sort of grew up and got on, life in the Clash probably got slightly better, but they were pretty hard on each other.
How close did that book get to actually coming out?
I did some sessions, and then Topper didn't, as I understood it, he didn't want it to come out while his father was still alive, and I don't think his father is now, because he didn't want his family to rub their faces into all the kind of excessive rock and roll stuff that he talks about. So it was put to one side, and whether it will come out in some form or another, I hope it does, because it's an extraordinary tale, and not just the Clash. After the Clash, he made some solo records and stuff, and he's very, just a very, very interesting character, and like the other members of the Clash, absolutely obsessed with music.
Yeah, the title was, I guess, depends on, I always say Headon. Some people say Headon, but the title of the book would be, the pronunciation is better if you say Headon Collision, right? That was Head-on Collision was, that was the title of the book, Headon Collision.
Yeah, I say both, by the way, or I end up saying both, Headon and Headon. I think it's Headon, actually. Yeah, I think he calls himself Headon.
The Booked on Rock podcast is part of the Boneless Podcasting Network. If you're a fan of classic rock and classic film like I am, go to boneless.lovable.app to find over 20 great shows there. That's boneless.lovable.app, or just go to bookedonrock.com, the Boneless Podcasting Network. It is what you want it to be. Listen with confidence. This is a quote from your book. By 1985, when they split, the Clash were all but unrecognizable from their 1977 model, but it was their valiant struggle to stay true to themselves and their ideals that makes their tale so fascinating. Why do you think that classic lineup ultimately imploded?
One of the reasons was, when we were talking about The Who a minute ago, what happens to a punk band from London were who played gigs where the tickets were uh, comparatively cheap, so lots of people so they were very affordable gig tickets. The merchandise was cheap. The records, London Calling and Sandinista was a triple, but it sold for the price of a double. And to do that, they waived the royalties on all their UK sales of the record, which is like nuts. So what happens when a band suddenly has a top 10 hit in America and elsewhere in the world, and the money starts kind of tumbling in? It created a real dilemma from them, because they'd sort of been, they always had cash in their back pocket, but what happens when you got the money to buy a house, or you got the money to buy a car and what have you? And I think it became a real ideological problem for them, how they would move on from supporting the Who. Would they do their own stadium tour? Would they end up supporting the Rolling Stones or something? I think that kind of ate away at them, really, and that was a big part. I mean, chucking Topper out of maybe that wasn't good, but yeah, I think as an entity, the Clash had a shelf life. If it was going to remain cool and authentic, it had a shelf life, as did the Pistols. But the Pistols' shelf life was much shorter, because that was always going to just implode. But the Clash fortunately went on to make all those great albums.
Mick Jones, was his last live appearance with the band at the US Festival?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Is that when the cracks start to show, or had it started before that?
After Topper was fired in 1982, they brought back the drummer who'd played on the first album, Terry Chimes. And Terry Chimes was the guy who drummed on the Who stadium tour. And he said that he didn't do the US Festival because he said it was clear to him that the Clash had no future, that at some point they wouldn't be able to work with Mick anymore. And he said the tension was so bad during the time that he was in that band towards the end of 1982 that he didn't want to be around it all. So I think if you read the book, I'd say in Mick's defense, and I think there's always somebody in a group who carries the burden of it all in terms of having to write the next record. And Joe could do his lyrics, obviously, but Mick had to come up with musicals. He always had to come up with the next single, the next album. They couldn't really do anything until Mick had turned up at rehearsal with a song, or the music to a song. And I think that weighed really heavily on him. It really weighed heavily on him. I think he really cared. He was a quality control was really high, and I think he was under a lot of pressure all the time. And it probably did make him be quite difficult to be around with. I think he was quite kind of when he was in the band to the beginning, he was quite sort of cocky and dismissive of people then. But I think it's because he carried that burden. And and if you draw a line back through their career, they're always arguing with Mick. They're always having problems. But that was part of the creative spark, I think.
Sure. Well, look at the band name, The Clash.
The Clash. Yeah, there it is, staring in the face
right?
all the time.
Yeah. So it was more of like a slow erosion. Like you say in the book, the purity of vision was slowly eroded by drugs, fame, and the music industry. Final question, looking back now, was the Clash ultimately a success story, a tragedy, or both?
Well, for me, a success story because they created like if you could read the book as a kind of a manual of how to do a band while being not caring what your record company thought. You could go on strike. You don't do things because other people think it's a good idea, or they say, oh, you'll make loads of money, or you're going to get really famous doing this. You don't. You make a band because it's the band that you want to be in, and that it's the band that you want to make and create. And also, as a political thing, the Clash really did open up people. I mean, I can only really speak from over here, but they really did open their eyes to politics and their message about being anti-racist and anti-fascist. There was, in the late 70s and early 80s over here, there was a huge rise in right-wing groups, movements and groups. And the Clash fought against that. That was their thing. So that idea of being a kind of a musical guerrilla unit fighting for the cause, for the good cause, it really did mean a lot to everybody. And I think that's their kind of legacy that still carries on. You just be cool, do what you want to do, but if it's the right thing, just hold on to it. Hold on to your moral integrity in the face of the music industry.
The only band that matters, and 50 years later, they still matter.
Hey, Eric, nice one.
Yeah. The new expanded 50th anniversary edition of Passion is a Fashion, the real story of the Clash. It is out now. You can find it wherever books are sold, all the usual outlets. You can look for it at your nearest independent bookstore. You can go to bookdownrock.com to find your nearest bookstore. All right, Pat, where can people find you online?
I've got my website, www.patgilbert.co.uk. And yeah, I'm easy to find. I'm everywhere.
I will put a link up in the show notes so people can check that out. Pat, this was awesome, man. Thanks so much. Love talking The Clash, and this is a phenomenal book. The original version, it just gets better as the years go on. So congrats on this book. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, Eric, thank you. That means a lot. And yes, thank you for having me on.
That's it. It's in the books.